Empathy. It's what connects us to others, but is there a limit to how much we can give?
I'm Cole Blake. I'm 77. I'm blessed that I live so close to a beach. Really blessed. That is my release. Now we're going to choir this afternoon. I've been married to Shirley for 49 years. How about that one? My role changed 6 years ago. Shirley was diagnosed with dementia. It was a shock, quite a shock. I've physically got to and mentally got to really think for two. White ones or the...
I think I'll have the creamy one.
Okay.
Always liked that one, yeah.
Shirley's very aware of her dementia and does make it easier for me. I love her dearly. I don't love her how I did 50 years ago. She's a completely different person, and that's probably hard to come to grips with a lot of times. Music's great for Shirley. Shirley and I have jived for 50 years, and when we jive, Shirley does not have dementia. No, it's all there. I can see why dementia would split up marriages. I couldn't do this without empathy. Empathy is the glue.
Cole, how has the empathy changed between you and your wife since Shirley's dementia diagnosis?
It has changed a lot. Shirley, when I look back, it was my carer. She looked after our children more than I did. We have 4 beautiful children, and I've said to them, it's now time to give back to Mum. What I've got to be aware of, though, Shirley is still Shirley, and I can't take that away from her. I don't want to do too much. I always try to limit my empathy, as it were.
What is the hardest part of caring for Shirley?
Everything. People think, oh, dementia is just something you lose your memory. That's the easy part. That's the confidence, the different person completely. It's something I never anticipated. When I said for better or worse, I didn't know what I was saying.
Shirley, is Cole a caring husband?
He certainly is. He does all the cooking, and I'm no cook.
What's his cooking like?
Good. Much better than me.
Cole, you said that you can understand how dementia can break up a marriage. What's made your relationship survive?
I couldn't do it without empathy. It's the love I've got and the care I want to give Shirley. She often says, you're doing too much. I said, no, I'm not. This is now my role, and I've accepted that. And I think I can see it breaking our marriage. A lot of people would just walk away from it. It's hard. It's hard work. And the thing is, I've purposely stayed positive with every step. And the thing with dementia, it goes in levels, and you can see it dropping in levels, and you've got to be aware of that, and you adjust yourself to those new levels.
What is your understanding of what empathy is?
It's not sympathy. It's just caring or showing you care for that person, you know, without taking it over. As I said, I don't want to change her personality. She's still the girl I married and the girl I still love. Yep.
Annie, both of your parents had dementia. What was that like for you, caring for both of them?
It was, really, really hard. My mum had Alzheimer's and my dad had Lewy bodies, so he was quite aggressive with it and had hallucinations. Mum was just a lovely, gentle soul. So grief, because they were disappearing as my parents in front of my eyes. Quite a lot of bitterness towards my dad. He was in denial when Mum was first diagnosed as well. So, yeah, we weren't managing our emotions too well. It was really quite hard.
How did all that affect your relationships?
I think because we weren't managing our stress, any of us didn't really have any tools. it really took a toll. I lost a business. We had an incident in Hong Kong where my dad insisted on taking mum to the other side of the world, and he got really sick, so I had to give up a business to go and look after him in Hong Kong. And it really affected them. And Dad ended up not talking to me for 2 years because he had this imagination that I'd stolen all his money.
Where did all that leave your empathy?
It was there, and I think on reflection now, what I was really suffering from was a thing called empathy fatigue.
As in, there was just no more empathy left, or you were tired?
Yeah, I absolutely exhausted, just completely fatigued all the time, and not knowing what to do next.
Mark, you're a former SAS soldier. Your first active duty was as a platoon commander in East Timor. What was your concept of empathy back then?
When I first joined the Army, I was only a young guy. I was in my early 20s. We did a peacekeeping mission to East Timor, and that was the first time I'd seen kind of, I guess, suffering at that level. They're a very poor country. A lot of people were badly affected by the incidents that had happened in the years prior. So we were dealing with families and kids that were coming back into East Timor that were in terrible shape. I'd never seen anything like it as a young person. Malnourished, living in refugee camps, no access to medical care. So I just couldn't believe that in a country that was so close to Australia that would happen.
Did that change the way you felt about Australians when you got back home?
Yeah, it did, because I think we've got it quite well in the West, and I think sometimes we forget that. And it was a good lesson for me to see how other cultures are doing it. Sometimes they don't have the things that we have, and we're pretty lucky as a society. I think it's easy to forget it.
You were subsequently deployed to Afghanistan 4 times. Was there a place for empathy on that battlefield?
This was hard because you have all the usual military movements and the combat and the things that we were planning for in Afghanistan, but a lot of what we were doing, again, you had to deal with people's human emotions, either in our teams and being able to relate to people, no matter what the fears they're having or whatever emotions they have, and also internally what you're feeling as well. I had all those range of emotions. That was a big part of it. But then having to use force against other people, that was a real shock for me, because even though I was trained for it, I wasn't ready for the human toll or the, I guess, how I felt about seeing that unfold. It was a real shock to me.
How did you not take everything on?
It's funny because we're not necessarily trained in that, but I think I would see certain things that I knew were totally out of the ordinary, someone killed or wounded, and I would keep going with the job because we had something to do, but I understood that later I would have to process that, but it wasn't the time to deal with it now, because if you did, you wouldn't be able to do those jobs.
You commanded 30 elite soldiers in Afghanistan. How did your mission change as the war went on?
At the start, it was more of a reconnaissance information collection role in the earlier days of Afghanistan, and as it went on, it got more and more kind of force orientated. It became more, they call it kinetic, but we were using a lot more force, targeting people specifically, and it's a totally different type of mission. So over the years, the war got, I guess, more and more violent.
So as the war dragged on, how were you feeling?
After my first tour, actually, I did a tour in 2007. We saw some heavy combat in that, and there were some injuries and a fatality in my team. And after that, I remember thinking, in order to survive, we're going to have to be very different, very ruthless, and we're going to have to do this in a way that's going to be difficult to accept in a normal world.
You've written that, quote, "There was no love in my heart and my moral compass had shifted." Where did that leave your empathy?
Yeah, I had an experience where a bunch of my guys were wounded in a roadside bomb explosion. And I remember thinking, and my attitude towards the locals and the civilians at that point had been, these people are kind of innocent until guilty. And after that, I just assumed that everyone was kind of out to get us. And it's not a good way to live, but it was necessary in that environment.
Ali, you did your PhD in group dynamics and you research human connection. What are the main types of empathy?
So there's two main types of empathy. One is affective empathy, so affect in the psychological sense of mood or emotion. And we think of that as an emotional type of empathy. And when we're engaging in affective empathy, we feel the feelings of another person. So this is also known as emotional contagion. So we would all relate to that when we might see a loved one in distress, and we ourselves can experience personal distress when we engage in that type of empathy. The other main type is cognitive empathy. And cognitive empathy is identifying or acknowledging the experience of another person without taking on their emotions. So whenever we're watching a movie and we see the main character going through their exploits, but we don't necessarily feel their feelings, we can identify that this is not my experience, and we don't generate the same sensations as though it was. But that distinction, I think, is extremely important between affective and cognitive.
There's a lot going on in the brain when we empathise. Let's take a look.
The brain is just beautiful. It's billions of cells with trillions of connections between them, somehow working together. The ability to use empathy is actually one of the most amazing things that our brains do. So this requires our memory, our feelings and emotions all to come together. So let's say you're empathizing with a loved one and they've just had something really great happen for them in their day. The likelihood is that your brain and body are actually releasing the same kinds of chemicals that their body and brain are releasing. So you might feel their pain, you might feel their hopes and desires, you might feel their success. It's almost a sort of magical trick that we can play with our minds. But I think of it as really crucial for so much of our social interaction and our ability to form lasting relationships with one another.
We contacted Google for the latest statistics on searches for the word empathy. Globally, it's never been higher, and Australians are searching it more than any other country except for Ireland. Ali, why are we so interested in empathy?
We're in the middle of a loneliness epidemic, and it gets a little bit less press than the other epidemic that we've been talking about. And I think there's a few reasons for that. We've lived through lockdowns in the last few years. We've had a spotlight put on our relationships, but also we've lived through a digital revolution, and our work and home lives have changed more than they did since the Industrial Revolution in the past sort of 5 to 10 years. And so the opposite of loneliness is connection, and empathy is the pathway to connection. So I think there's this new spotlight on relationships and how we can do them better, how we can practice them in a more meaningful and intentional way. We've also seen a decline in religious participation. So I think people are trying to replace that with a sense of community and with their relationships. So it's almost this place where science and religion converge to say that empathy is a very positive thing for us. It's almost become our new direction for how we live our lives.
So does feeling empathy make us a good person?
So when we engage in empathy, we're more likely to also engage in pro-social behaviour. So we respect others, we trust others, and then as a feedback loop, people are more likely to engage in that kind of behaviour with us. We're more likely to be seen as moral actors, and our relationships are more satisfying. So it's almost like empathy is the bridge that gets us to satisfying and meaningful connection, which is our greatest psychological need.
Seamus, you're autistic. How do others perceive your ability to empathise and to connect?
The perception is that we don't have empathy, where the way we actually process emotions and sensory is very different to the neurotypical population. We feel things a lot deeper. What we actually lack on is the cognitive empathy, so the position taking. So that's what we struggle in. The overall perception that I've found is that we're seen as sociopathic, as in we don't have emotions and we don't have empathy, but we process it very differently and a little bit slower compared to, well, this is from my experience, than just the general neurotypical population.
When people think you're not capable of having empathy, how does that make you feel?
It's a lot of processing, but the way that I generally deal with it is through advocacy and actually explaining to people the different types of empathy, how I process it, how there's sensory needs around being autistic. that I don't think a lot of people are completely aware of. For instance, I'm far more practical in terms of empathy, that I want to actually do something. I feel it a lot deeper, but it's not necessarily seen as the same neurotypical standard, if you will.
Jo, you're a single mum with 3 kids, 2 have autism. How do you feel when other people say autistic people have no empathy?
Look, it makes me so sad, and I suppose I get really frustrated. I mean, my boys are both so different. I always joke I have a Rain Man and Elon Musk, and that's not an offensive thing to say. Rain Man was a real person, but that's what it is like. You know, right. Giovanni looks autistic. Philip is just like Elon Musk. He wants to be part of the colony on Mars. My dad truly engaged with my boys, got to understand how to communicate with them consistently, and he died. And, the rug was pulled out from under us because I felt so alone, and so did the boys. And Philip is more animated and was able to articulate how he was feeling as it happened. He was very close to my dad. Giovanni, who I named after my dad, I asked him if he wanted to come to the hospital. He said yes. He sat there quietly for about 15 minutes, then walked out. That was enough for him. That was fine. He didn't cope with the funeral because it was sensory overload. He injured himself. He had to be taken home. And I just was so stuck in grief. I was trying to figure out what to do for Giovanni because I knew that it was bubbling inside and I didn't know how it was going to express itself. And, spoke to a couple of therapists, left him alone. And it took him a good 3 or 4 months to even talk about my dad and say that he missed him, that he wishes he'd spent more time with him, that he was sorry that he found it hard to go to the aged care home because it was too noisy for him. He said that he wished that he didn't think so much of himself and his sensory issues and was able to just go more to see my dad. And that just shows the depth of his emotion and his empathy, and it just took him a long time to process it and articulate it and be able to share it.
As a mother of autistic children, does empathy play a role for you?
Of course. I mean, anyone who becomes a parent understands there's so much judgment about how we parent. And then, add to that having 2 special needs kids, and that is ramped up completely. My boys are 2 of the loneliest people in the world because they want friends and girlfriends and jobs and houses and lives, but they don't know how to do it. And when they do it incorrectly, it's judged. And my eldest is 18 and he's home every day. He does uni online. He wants friends. And my little boy goes to a support unit. People try to start conversations with him, but he doesn't really understand true friendships. So they're online a lot. They've got some online friends, which is a wonderful gift for them, but they're lonely. And as a result, so was I.
Seamus, what about empathy, say, on the dating scene? Like, what kinds of things have people said to you when they find out you're autistic?
Are you allowed near kids, and what type of medication are you on? The worst date I had, what happened was she ended up walking out and saying that when she found out that I was autistic, that people like me shouldn't be allowed on the apps.
What do you say to that? I mean, she ended up walking out, but how do you process that?
I look at it like that is she's potentially excluding herself from a good partner. So from my perspective, I guess she did me a favour.
So romance has been hard?
Very, very challenging.
Lee, when you were a child, you noticed you were different. How?
When I was growing up, I experienced a severe lack of empathy, like on the playground one time. Like, it was like, if you can imagine, like monkey bars and whatnot. There was a kid crawling on the monkey bars. He falls off the monkey bars, and I'm pretty sure he snapped his wrist, now that I think about it. And he was yelling and screaming, crying, and I remember just staring at him, just like super agitated, super angry at him, because I knew that recess was gonna end, And the teacher came and got him, and there was no other teachers out there, so everybody had to go inside, and I'm yelling and screaming at him. I'm angry. I think I'm about to kick him. I was so angry at him. So I experienced just being different from a very young age.
As an adult, how did your lack of empathy show up in family life?
I'm married and I have 3 kids now. There was a moment when my wife, I think she was at work one time, and then my youngest son, my middle son, he was like 7 months old at the time. And I remember he just would not stop yelling. I was just like, oh my goodness, I'm trying to do work. He was just screaming and yelling. And so my mind just kind of shut off, and I started screaming and yelling at him. And my wife happened to come home at the exact same moment, you know, perfect timing. And me and her get to screaming and yelling, and then she leaves the house, and then on the way out the house, she calls me the word a narcissist. She's like, it's hard living with a narcissist. And I got inquisitive, and I looked it up on, you know, on Google, and it came up. It was like, did you mean narcissistic personality disorder? I was like, well, you know, I didn't mean that, but let's dig deeper. I look up the signs and symptoms and the traits of that, and lo and behold, I feel like that's me. You know, it explained to me how I've been feeling for a long time and why I didn't connect to, you know, to that kid on the playground, or to my kids when they're crying, or my wife when she, you know, in need of some emotional support and things like that.
You were diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD, in 2018. When you had that diagnosis, did you feel any different?
Yeah, it made me feel like an alien, but at least I knew what type of alien I was, you know, it just, you know.
Cam, you're a psychiatrist and you treat people with NPD. Yeah. Do narcissists often have low empathy?
Yeah, I suppose it depends on the degree of narcissism. I think a lot of times we say that people either have empathy or no empathy. I don't think it's that categorical. And I think empathy lies on a continuum. So it's a matter of how much we have or how little we have.
So narcissists can be nice?
Yes.
It's good to hear, Lee. Can you give us an example of what sits at each end of that empathy spectrum?
Well, I guess if you compare empathy with the analogy of pain, so on the extreme end where there's very little empathy, these are the people who kind of like tend to cause pain to other people, or they don't actually understand the pain that the other people are suffering from. And then on the other end, where you have people who have a lot of empathy, and they tend to pick up on other people's feelings, and they get too much into the other person's world, and they actually cause pain to themselves. And they need to have kind of proper coping mechanism to deal with that.
Lee, do you find it hard to put yourself in someone else's shoes?
So now that I've been in psychotherapy for the last 6 years, I feel like it's easier now than it used to be. Like, I would just describe it as like, I see your shoes. I see the type of shoe you have on. You might have on some Nikes right now. You know, I can see the Nikes. I understand that they are Nikes, but they are not my size. I can't necessarily fit into those shoes. I see the shoes. I understand it, you know, but they just don't fit me.
Has anyone ever used your empathy deficit against you?
So typically when I'm online, like talking about, you know, living with narcissistic personality disorder and whatnot, people tend to call me a demon and devil and Jezebel spirit and all things like that because of the, you know, the perceived lack of empathy and that they might have dealt with in their life. So I get that kind of feedback online all the time. But, you know, I kind of just make jokes out of it now. I kind of roll with the punches with it.
Do you feel like people sort of hold empathy as something that's sort of higher moral ground?
A lot of people treat, you know, I guess when they see what I have going on and they assume I have a lack of empathy, they make it seem like empathy is like this precious jewel that, you know, everybody has that I can't get. And they just, you know, hold it, they wear it around their neck like a, you know, like a special necklace.
And how do you feel about that?
I mean, it's fine. You know,
yeah.
I have my own necklace. I just, you know, you know, it's all good.
Lee, would you say you're an empathetic person?
Yes, I would. I probably didn't understand a lot about empathy until some time ago when I was having a difficult time in life and was doing a lot of reading to try and understand what was going on for myself, and started reading about empathy and empaths. And when I read about empaths, I started making sense of who I was, that, yeah, the world comes at me in a hard way. It's like I have no filter, really flimsy barrier.
So you're quite sensitive?
I'd call myself highly sensitive. In my family, I'm known as 98% emotion.
Are you?
Yeah.
You've worked in bereavement care for more than 20 years. What does that involve?
I'm a social worker by profession, and I first started working in paediatric oncology many, many years ago now, and naturally, some of the children and families I was working with, the children would transition to palliative care, and so I'd work with families and supporting them through that time and then into bereavement. And since that time, I became really interested in the state of play in terms of the health system's response to the care of bereaved families after a child dies. So I soon found myself working in paediatric palliative care, and that's where I've stayed ever since. I still work in the context of paediatric palliative care in some form.
Is it important to have empathy to do the work that you do?
I believe it is. I do. For me, empathy means that great innate capacity to feel deeply. And when you're working with a family as a health professional and you're either delivering bad news or sitting alongside a family that's received devastating news, or a family whose child has just died, or a family whose child died 10 years ago, and they're still expressing that real unmet need for love and care, to hold empathy is a gift. I feel it's a gift and something that we need to honour people with when they're deeply suffering.
How do you find enough empathy when you're surrounded by grief and death, I'd assume nearly every day of your working life?
For me, it's just this overflowing empathy. I can't stop it. It's like a waterfall. It never stops.
Has it ever got too much?
Yeah, it has. There was a time some years ago where I had an experience of what I call burning out. I was at the end of completing a PhD. I had been advocating strongly for the hospital I was working in to respond more effectively to the care of bereaved families, and it's very hard to get them to listen. Hospitals are very focused on cure and shy away from death and dying. Life was a bit tricky at home, so every part of my life was full, and I was invited into a new leadership role in the hospital, and I tried to resist because I can remember saying to my manager, who was a good friend as well, you know, I'm really empty. I can feel I don't have a lot to offer at the moment. And he said, look, a little bit of Lee's better than no Lee. And I wish I'd heeded my own inner voice, because I stepped into the role, and before too long, there was a day I woke up and sat on the couch at home and just started crying and crying and crying. It was like the waterfall was pouring out of my heart and eyes, and it was scary, really scary. So my partner at the time called an ambulance, and I had a little trip to the mental health unit, outpatient mental health unit, and was medicated and had a referral to see a psychotherapist for 6 months, and it was a really difficult time. I had 8 weeks off work, which wasn't enough.
What do you put that burnout down to?
I think part of it is that I do care deeply, I feel deeply, and when you're advocating for families, particularly these families that I was meeting who I could see there was so much suffering, and knowing that we could do so much more, but the system was saying no, that hurt. It hurt immensely.
Annie, before you became your parents' carer, you were working as a school teacher. In 2008, you won a Young Teacher of the Year award. Were you given any advice when you started out on that career?
I think academically I was prepared for it. I wasn't prepared so much for the social emotional side of being a primary school teacher, and initially I was just told, you know, you've got this award, all you need to do is just add your compassion to your bag of tools, really, before you go in.
What happened in the first couple of years in the classroom?
The first year was pretty challenging, and I was actually in my 40s, so I think they thought they'd just leave me alone because I have worldly wise and I'm able to cope with everything, but a beginning teacher is a beginning teacher. But I got through the first year, and then the second year, about halfway through term 1, I was told that a little boy was starting in my class the next day. He had fetal alcohol syndrome, sensory processing disorder, and had severe trauma and absolutely no language. And he was very violent, so I would remove 26 other kids, sometimes a couple of times a day, to keep them safe from him, to keep him safe somewhere in there, and me in the mix somewhere as well. And he was in my class apparently because I had the most compassion in the school.
What was he like in the class?
You know, what I know now about trauma on the brain, I certainly didn't understand it then and had no training on it. And he was terrified most of the time.
How did that affect you emotionally?
It was really hard for me because I'd won this award, I'd found my why, my purpose, I guess. I couldn't have my own children, so that was something I really wanted to make a difference and work with young kids. And I thought I was doing all the right things, but just nothing was working. My wake-up call was I I was cooking tea for my husband and some saucepans fell out on the floor. And I didn't realise, now I know that I'm triggered by very loud noises because of this little boy's scream. And I cried hysterically for about 3 hours. I went to the doctor the next day and she signed me off for a week and said that I had post-traumatic stress.
Did your capacity to show empathy change after that?
Yes, it did. I think what I understand of empathy is that I was connecting, and because this little boy was in fight or flight all the time, I was actually in fight or flight all the time but didn't realise it. So eventually I fatigued from that empathy, I guess, and I had the opposite. I had apathy, that I didn't really care about myself or anything else in my life. I felt I'd lost energy and confidence and any enthusiasm for the job at all.
Where did that leave your teaching career, Annie?
Sadly, and it's still really hard to say, as 18 months after winning that award, I walked away from the profession because I couldn't see how I was going to make myself well whilst doing that incredibly, wonderful job, but very stressful job. So I walked away.
Lee, as a social worker, does this sound familiar?
Absolutely. I mean, you're continually confronting suffering all the time, and empathy is really important to maintain really good and trusted relationships with those who are suffering. But, there's a really fine line between caring and caring too much. There's, particularly in an area like paediatric palliative care, there's this bottomless pit of need. And it's not our job to fill that bottomless pit of need. It's our job to remain strong enough but compassionate enough to continue walking alongside for that family you're with and for so many more.
Ali, before you studied human connection, you left behind a career in criminal law. Why?
In the courtroom, you are exposed to a whole range of human emotion, not all of it positive, in fact, most of it very negative. And so I thought of myself as being an empathetic person. But now that I've researched it since, I understand that what I was doing was engaging in affective empathy with everybody that was surrounding me at work. And when you engage in affective empathy, you are feeling the sensations of the people around you. You're taking them on because you care. And when we do that at work, it's actually a recipe for empathy fatigue, vicarious trauma, burnout, a whole range of things. And so I slowly realised that day in, day out, I was facing cases, sexual assault cases, child sexual assault cases, and I wasn't sure how to use my empathy. And I knew that I was experiencing that context in a different way to my colleagues. I would say to people, how do you deal with this, with what we're working in? And some people would say, deal with what? And so that almost then made me think, this problem is with me. And now I work with people who are in settings like that, in that very training, in order to keep people working who have important skills but just don't have the emotional scaffolding to protect themselves from that complex trauma.
Is there data to suggest that burnout and empathy fatigue are on the rise?
Definitely. And again, it's important to differentiate between the two terms. So burnout is actually an occupational phenomenon. And so it's something that is associated with demands at work. It can be increased distance from your job, exhaustion, decline in performance, whereas empathy fatigue is actually reduced capacity to care for somebody whose role it is to care for others.
Cam, to what extent do you need to have empathy when treating your psychiatric patients?
Well, I think empathy is actually the basic of a doctor-patient relationship. I don't believe that a person can actually function as a psychiatrist without empathy. Having said that, in psychiatry, we also talk about accurate empathy. And I think accurate empathy is something that is balanced by a boundary. So I think a simple way to look at empathy is to think about the ability to step into the other person's world without living in that world.
Right.
And I think a lot of times we suffer from empathy fatigue because we actually stay in that world for too long.
Lee, have you established more self-protective measures since you've burnt out?
Oh, absolutely. I feel a bit hardwired now. In a way, burnout is hard and it takes a long time to recover, and I'm not sure if you ever really fully recover because I'm a little hardwired now. I immerse myself in nature. I know for me nature's a healer. It gives so much and takes nothing away. So it, in a way, becoming burnt out is a gift to someone who's got such a high level of empathy because it's taught me how better to care for myself.
Lee, you are a diagnosed narcissist and you consider your lower empathy to be beneficial. Why is that?
I feel like my inability to connect to people on such a deep level actually protects me sometimes. I just feel like because your empathy can actually be weaponized against you a lot in today's world. Like, even with her telling her story, I just feel like even the school system weaponized her empathy against her. They said it. Who has the most compassion? Oh, you? You know, and they can set you up like that in that dynamic. And even on, like, in war, when he was talking about it earlier, like, if you give empathy to the wrong person, you might end up losing your life. You might end up getting harmed in certain situations and things like that. So I just feel like the lack can be a benefit sometimes.
And if someone's sort of feeling sad or emotional, do you ever feel like you don't want to be sort of dragged down by their emotions?
Yeah, I just feel like, so, again, it's just like that protective measure that kind of kicks in with me, where I don't necessarily, I can see people getting sad and emotional around me, but I don't necessarily connect to it like that.
Yep.
So if I'm even talking to people about like a sad situation and they're like boo-hoo crying, and I'm just like, okay, I get why you're crying, I understand why you're being emotional right now, but let me give you an alternate perspective right now, you know.
You and your wife got back together after you started therapy for your narcissistic personality disorder. What have you learnt about how to be empathetic?
So I just feel like now, like, I can be more, like when she was saying earlier about more cognitive empathy. I can understand her emotions, why she, like, if she's crying, like her grandma passed away. And I'm like, dang, grandma passed away. I'm not sad at all, but she's crying. I can hug her, I can connect to her and let her cry. You know, I can let her cry, and I can also handle situations around the house and things like that while she's sad. It helps me.
Yeah.
And it also helps her more along the lines now.
Has learning empathy helped you interact better with your kids?
Yeah. So just like even developing more cognitive empathy now, and just listening to my wife and watching her interact with my kids. Like even on the way here, my youngest son had started crying because he was gonna miss me, and my first thought was shut the car door, and just get on the plane. But I was just like, okay, that's not gonna work. So I gave him a hug and a kiss as opposed to shutting the door and flying away.
Yeah.
So.
And how does he react to that?
He probably would have screamed and cried loud if I'd have shut the door on him.
Yeah.
But the fact that I gave him a kiss and stuff, like it helps him. You know. So if it helps him, I'm all for it now.
Welcome everyone. This topic is about using our imagination to try to work out how other people feel. It's to give us practice in putting ourselves in other people's shoes. So right now, you are standing on the playground, waiting for your friend Maya to get to school so that she can play basketball. So you run up to her. Maya mumbles, "I don't feel like playing today." How does that make you feel? Olivia?
It makes me feel a bit angry and inside because she just betrays your team. I'd feel a bit disappointed, but it would be rude to say that to Maya's face, and then she might get offended.
Alice, what do you think?
I'd feel a bit upset that they didn't feel good enough to play, and I'd feel quite disappointed.
So suppose you do run after Maya and ask her why she doesn't feel like playing. And suppose Maya says, "It's my dog, Misty. She's really sick and I'm worried."
I would be feeling a little sick in the tummy because I was worrying too much and thinking of all the negative things that could happen to Misty.
I'm not sure because I don't own any pets. I haven't seen many pet problems.
So suppose you've never had a pet. Do you think that makes it harder to understand how Maya feels?
It's a bit harder because you don't know if they get sick. It's like losing a family member and you can get really emotional.
When they start each one giving their views, they build on each other's ideas. And from there, they do take in different perspectives and then develop, can they be empathetic to others?
Kelby, you write ethics classes in New South Wales public schools. Why do we need to teach kids empathy?
That lesson's actually a little unusual, and that one is specifically about empathy. But what we already see in that lesson is that these kids come to the class with a whole lot of empathy. They're already capable of explaining how they would feel in the situation or how other people would feel in a situation like that. So we know that most neurotypical humans in most environments will develop capacities for empathy in both the cognitive and affective spheres that we've already heard.
Are you teaching kids how to be good people?
No, that's not what we do in primary ethics. So we go in, we tell them a story, and we ask questions about the story. So through that process, we're teaching them critical thinking, and we're teaching them, just as importantly, we're teaching them how to talk to people who have different views from their own. Now, the way we do that is through stories, and stories are a way of really developing empathy, for sure.
Lee, you're working on your empathy through therapy. How do you feel about your narcissistic traits now?
They're still there. They don't go away. But I just feel like being in psychotherapy for so long, it just helps me connect to people better. And actually, I would say the main thing I've learned is to actually listen to people and let them finish talking, so I can respond as opposed to react to them. Just like gaining more understanding of where they're actually coming from and what they're actually saying.
Does that make you feel differently?
Yeah, I feel good, you know. I feel less alien.
Cam, you're a psychiatrist. Can narcissists be taught to be more empathetic?
Yes, I think in your therapy with your therapist, Lee, I suppose that is a way of kind of like, we would say that as reparenting. You're talking to your therapist and then telling the story, and then the therapist is able to reflect back to you the emotions within that story or how the other person feels. Yeah. And I think that is something that innately for human beings, I think most of the time parents do that to us, you know, when we are kind of young, when we are 1 or 2 years old, and our parents reflect back the feeling to us by their facial expressions or by words, then we learn that what we do have an impact on another person. So one way of understanding narcissistic personality is that they probably look at the world kind of through thick glasses or a barrier. And I think it's great that, you know, you have chosen to sort of get through that glass door onto the other side.
Okay.
Cam, you also treat patients with autism spectrum disorder. How do you help them manage their relationships?
I help them through narrative therapy. And in fact, what the teacher is doing in the classroom is exactly what I do. So they usually come in and with a story, and as a therapist, I try to give them another perspective of the narrative or the story. And the other thing that I do is I do actually support and, I suppose, lobby for the young people in the classroom and in the school. And it's amazing that a lot of them, the schools and the teachers don't actually understand their behavior.
Right.
So actually going there to talk to the principals and to talk to the teachers and say, look, you know, when little Johnny write about blowing up the school, it's not like he wants to do that, he's just angry. And you don't have to be worried about that. Don't actually have to report him to DCJ, for example. You just have to talk about his feelings.
Seamus, you found dating difficult. What have you learnt about romantic love?
I guess I really hadn't found the right person, and it's really someone who understands autism and understands, I guess, the emotional differences between it and the sensory aspects.
And did you find that person?
Yes, I did.
And who is that person? Joe?
Yes, Joe.
Joe, you and Seamus have been together a year now.
Yeah.
How did you meet?
At an Autism Awareness Australia event, as you do. I connected with the organisation to get support and learn for my children. And there was an event and my brother used to work for one of the women who was there. So we went along together, and on the way in, he looked at the flyer and said, "Oh, Seamus is going to be there." And I was like, "Oh, who's Seamus?" And he said they used to work together, and I was like, "Oh, cool, you'll have someone to talk to, you won't sort of bother me." And then we got there, and Seamus walked in with someone else, and they were just standing there, and not another partner, no, just with another ambassador.
Yes.
And my brother introduced us, and we got to talking, and he explained he was autistic. I spoke about my kids. We sort of got separated that night. I sent a flirty Instagram message the next day.
I didn't
He
pick up
didn't
on
know
that.
he did not know I was being flirty. He was like, "Really? Is that what flirting is?" And when I said I'd love to grab a coffee, and I knew, because I knew autism, I knew we should choose a place where you were comfortable. So I drove out all the way to him, to his favourite coffee shop, freaked him out a bit about asking if the coffee was good. And we spoke for 4 hours, and haven't looked back.
And 2 of your sons have autism, Jo. Do they get along well with Seamus?
They do. I mean, I was never going to date again. If I couldn't make it work with my autistic children's father, I couldn't be bothered doing it with anyone. I didn't want to let anyone near them. I was too scared. How could they possibly understand and accept my boys? But, then, the universe designed this perfect person. I introduced him as soon as possible. The boys and Seamus get on like a house on fire. My daughter's going to take a little longer. And we're just like this awesome neurodiverse tribe.
Wow.
And we love sharing our story because we want more people to understand the awesomeness and honesty and emotion and how fantastic it is to have neurodiverse people in your life.
Seamus, what kind of things do you do with Jo's kids?
We've both got the same interest in, I guess, comic books, movies and games. So those are probably the big talking points.
Wrestling, South
and
Park,
wrestling.
food.
Yeah, I've definitely got got your boys into wrestling. And,
KFC nuggets.
KFC nuggets. Yeah.
McDonald's nuggets.
And what's the key, do you think, to making your relationship with Jo work?
I think the key is understanding autism, and the best way to look at it is, to me, being autistic is part of my personality, so you can't really separate the two. So that's kind of what works from my point of view, and from Jo's perspective, she needs someone who understands autism as well. So it's very much, an awesome connection from that respect.
Lee, you are still working in bereavement care. How can you make sure that you won't burn out again?
I'm really conscious of those things that trigger me. I'm really much better at looking after myself. I've learned that I need my solitude and time out, time away from people. I make immersing myself in nature a priority, talking with peers and trusted colleagues. I think I own who I am now, and I think that helps.
Mark, you left the military in 2014 after 16 years. Have you recovered your sense of empathy now that you are a civilian?
Yeah, it took a long time because I left the military. I was quite burned out as well. I had that same feeling of being kind of overworked and empathy, largely run out. So I went and studied in the US for a couple of years full time, and that was my chance to kind of recover and get my bearings back and just invest a bit in my own personal health. Because I think when you're in the military or you're doing these deployments, you're putting a lot of work into your mission and you're trying to help your team, and you don't necessarily support your own needs as much as you should. And so I guess doing that for a couple of years and then trying to find purpose outside the military was an important step for me, and I just over the years kind of rebuilt myself into a normal civilian.
Ali, is having empathy a blessing or a trap?
I would absolutely say that it's a gift or a superpower, but we don't treat it as such yet. And I'm really passionate about turning it into something that we treat as we would a gift in maths or music. We'd give somebody a coach or a mentor, and we'd support them to realise their fullest potential in that way.
Cole, you swim regularly to release the stresses of 24/7 carer to your wife, Shirley.
Yeah.
Does that keep your empathy cup full?
Probably not, but it helps.
Yeah.
It's Yeah, just what Seamus said before about finding the right girl. Well, I found the right girl. I found I was lucky. And I think that's what's made my empathy a lot stronger. Like this morning I was at a dementia carers meeting, and every hour Shirley's at home, but I'll ring. And I think that I wouldn't have done that 20 years ago. Yeah, I'd get home. But now I'm more aware that I'm a carer, and I have those feelings that I've got to make sure she's okay.
You've said that empathy is the glue.
Yep.
What has this chapter of marriage taught you about love and commitment?
This is hard love. Back 50 years ago, it wasn't hard. It was soft love, but this is what real love's all about.
Cole, thank you so much. Shirley, thank you so much. Thank you to you all for being here tonight. That's all we have time for. Thank you too for joining us. I'll see you next week.